Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and I just got back from the new film Inside Llewyn Davis, which is the latest film from the Coen brothers. The titular character, Llewyn Davis, played by Oscar Isaac, and about a week of his life in Greenwich Village in 1961 as he ventures around with a cat, goes to Chicago, comes back, plays a lot of gigs, and goes about life in his very unsuccessful bid to be a folk singer. I guess that's kind of the plot. I don't think this film really does have a strict plot, and that's kind of one of the things I like when the Coen brothers do. I would say this is probably somewhat like, not exactly like, The Big Lebowski, in which nothing really happens and you're wondering what exactly the point is, but you had a good time. In this film, I think probably has less of a point than Big Lebowski, and Joe Coen even said they threw the cat in because they thought it would give it more of a point. I did actually kind of feel like I was in a dream, because when I left the film afterwards, if you ever wake up and you're not sure like what day it is at first, you know, you're like, oh, is it Tuesday? You're like, no, it's Thursday. What was I thinking? I felt that way after watching this film, and it's interesting that as odd and as folksy as this film is, and even the Coen brothers' style is very kind of surreal but well-researched history, I still get very immersed in it. A good, real kind of Coen brothers movie. I think this is the first very kind of heavy Coen brothers movie I've seen since A Serious Man, and I think it might be a little more simplistic and easier to understand than A Serious Man, but that's just the first viewing. With Coen brothers films, I often think that they change as time goes on. The more time that's between the movie and you, the more your interpretation of it changes. Just look at how much time changed since The Big Lebowski came out, and the way it is now, it's completely different. So part of me thinks this isn't as complicated, but maybe in 2 years I'll feel differently. Llewyn Davis, who is based on Dave Van Ronk, who was a folk singer in the early 60s and actually made an album called Inside of Van Ronk. That's the actual album cover. Inside Llewyn Davis that Llewyn Davis has put out is exactly the cover of Dave Van Ronk, one of his albums, and he was kind of a mentor to Bob Dylan when Bob Dylan was in the folk scene. And this film kind of shows more about the folk scene than what most people know if you not really into folk or anything, is that Bob Dylan was in the folk scene and then eventually he wasn't. This focuses on the folk scene, but through this kind of imagined character, Llewyn Davis. And Llewyn Davis has to go through all this stuff, and nothing seems to really go his way, almost in an existential drama sort of way. But it's also very funny, complaining Jewish New York way, and Oscar Isaac plays that very well, makes him very human. He could easily become a character who just complains too much and nothing works out for her, and you're like, oh ho hum, but he gives him such kind of a realness and reality to him. You understand there's a lot more going on, that he feels more like a complicated character. There's one part where he has to hitchhike and his car is pulled over, and it's a very bizarre set of circumstances, but you kind of almost understand his thought process. A lot of the times you understand why he does certain things, why he thinks certain things, why he's cynical, why he doesn't really expect almost to get anywhere after a while, why he keeps doing it also. Oscar Isaacs, who's mainly, people keep saying he's a character actor. I guess he is. He was in Drive, where he also went out with Carrie Mulligan in that. I think this is kind of a prequel to Drive in an imaginary universe that I just made up. But Oscar Isaac has an everyman way about him. He has that within him, and within him as an actor, to play kind of an everyman who's trying to break into this folk scene. Doesn't really know what he wants out of it, but he knows that he wants to do it. And I think any artistic pursuit is very much like that, and having an actor who he at least gets that. What's it like to be a working artist? You also get understanding his motivations, because he's very good at physically portraying a lot of this stuff, and he's a pretty good musician also. This is probably the most sinister and dark I've ever seen Carrie Mulligan. She plays it off really well. Even from the trailers, I thought some of the lines she was saying were really hilarious. This is the most sarcastic and dark, and her voice is a lot lower than usual, but I think it really works for her. She was very excellent. Probably her best comedic role I've ever seen her do. I actually like the cat quite a bit. It's often weird when the Coen brothers work with a different cinematographer. This is only the fourth cinematographer they've ever worked with. Barry Sonnenfeld did the first 3, and then Roger Deakins has done pretty much everything else except for the one that Emmanuel Lubezki did, which was Burn After Reading. This is a very interestingly well shot Coen Brothers film. The cinematographer who also shot Amelie, A Very Long Engagement, actually shot Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. I didn't really know of him until this, and when you shoot a Coen Brothers movie, it is a big deal, but he has an interesting flair to it. Almost looks like everything is kind of glowing, like there's a morning dew on everything in a weird way, but that works for it. There's kind of this weird effect that happens with the way he does his shots, where if someone is walking in the background or the foreground and they go into a shadow, it almost feels like they're like weirdly animated. Their body distorts in a weird way. I noticed that with Carrie Mulligan and with the cat. Almost everyone is in the foreground, and behind them everything is out of focus. Like, this film is very distinct about what it wants you to focus on. Bruno Delbonnel, I think that's how you say his name, added that to this film. As much as this is a different kind of cinematographer for them, it still feels like a Coen Brothers movie. I still think their best collaborator is Roger Deakins, but Bruno Delbonnel does an amazing job, and it's probably one of the best times I've seen them collaborate with someone who isn't like a Roger Deakins, and both showcasing Bruno Delbonnel and the Coen Brothers visual style at the same time to make this kind of rich, kind of somber, like wintry tale that also feels like you're constantly in the morning but gives it the surreal quality you need. This film does have kind of an odd flow about it in the way that Coen Brothers films do. It does feel like kind of like a Barton Fink, Oh Brother Where Art Thou, Big Lebowski, Serious Man kind of a movie. The music's such a part of this film, but you leave thinking about folk music and thinking about the folk scene and wanting to get more into it. I like films that will kind of abandon structure in such an odd, kind of pointless way that the Coen Brothers do. It's kind of weird because when I think about this movie, I almost feel like it does have 3 acts, but it clearly really doesn't. But I think like the first act is really the beginning in New York, the second act's the road trip to Chicago, and then the third act is when he comes back to New York. But that might not be there at all. In most Hollywood films, they really like to show that the main character is something special, is something important, is, you know, they really deserve to be this thing and so forth. The whole deserving to be the hero is never in a Coen Brothers film. Instead of showing someone who's spectacular and special, they like to show someone who's spectacularly unspecial, almost in the reverse way, but a lot more humbler. And especially in this film with Llewyn Davis. A.O. Scott, I think it was, who's commented on how it feels like they like really don't like their characters. They kind of like him going through all these problems. In a way, I think it's kind of in a strange Kafka, kind of funny Kafka, if you can imagine that way about it. But I don't think they dislike him. I just think as an artist, that kind of is what happens to you if you want to work on your craft. Sometimes like nothing works out and you're spending all this time working on this thing and you have to have a job to make money in addition to doing your art, and it's just hard sometimes. But I think they made it in kind of a very comedic way, but in a very real, dreamlike way. In some ways, this film is very describable and undescribable. It feels like I can wrap my head around it, but the more I think about it, I think maybe I was completely misguided in thinking that. And even how he captures the folk scene when he stays at someone's house and he has a box of his old records, and then he finds like almost an identical box of the guy he's staying with, his records, like everybody ends up with a box of their records that the record company couldn't sell, and the burgeoning folk scene at the time. The Coen Brothers made a real return to form for them. I know some people were disappointed in True Grit. I wasn't really disappointed in True Grit. I know it's kind of more of a mainstream Coen Brothers film. It was an adaptation, so it was a bit different, but this is kind of more closer to their original work, and gloriously so. It's definitely one of the films that I'm very happy to have experienced, one of my more favorite films I've seen this year. And I love the flow about it. I like how it captures something about the 60s, but isn't just interested in telling you about the history. It's like kind of in a folktale. I feel like this is partly the Coen Brothers doing their original voice, but almost a kind of, the way it tells its story is like what a folk singer would like a movie about himself to be like lyrics to a folk song. The charm of it and the story of it and the pointlessness of it is just a fun, interesting experience. And I think with some of these films, it's more of an experience than a story. Sometimes they're both not storytellers and they are storytellers, and all that wraps up into why the Coen brothers have become such interesting auteurs. So if you have seen Inside Llewyn Davis and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. But as a cat owner, I have to say a lot of the stuff with the cats really freaked me out and made me like there's a certain parts I was like, when the cat leaves the apartment, like, oh my god, I would be mortified if that happened. She actually just jumped up on my lap during this part. So it's really, really, just good timing, don't you?